Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and the people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. May the
That'll keep you on your toes. Gospel reading for this morning, continuing in the 12th chapter of Luke's Gospel, verses 49 to 56. I came to cast fire upon the earth, and would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with. And how am I constrained until that is accomplished and completed? Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on, there will be 5 in one family, divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. And he said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say it's going to rain, and it does. And when the south wind blows, you say it's going to be hot, and it is. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? May God bless to our understanding the reading from God's holy word.
Thanks be to God.
There has long been a tradition in the church, one that still exists in parts of the body today, that pretty much says that we're all going to hell if we don't fly right. This school of thought or theology basically says that God is a God of harsh judgment, ready to foist calamity upon the wicked and condemnation upon people. Now, admittedly, there are times when I wish that God would visit such judgment upon some souls, just so long as they're not me. I mean, I have a list. Eternal damnation to all those jerks that I don't like or who've wounded me. Fortunately for creation's sake, I'm not God. And while God is a judge, we really have to re-examine that eternal damnation part. There are times where I really would like to get into a hellfire and brimstone sermon. I came to cast fire upon the earth, and would that it were already kindled. Do you think that I have come to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, division. Father against son, mother against daughter, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law. Well, that one's fairly common. God's judgment being preached upon we wicked souls is a pretty common theme in a lot of churches. But as we hold to faith in a God of grace, that doesn't happen too often around here. My stomach wouldn't do well with preaching like that anyway. Still, we have to ask ourselves the question, what sort of judgment is there from a God of grace? Both of our passages for this morning, from Isaiah and from Luke, have those judgmental elements. In Isaiah, the metaphor of the vineyard, one of the many in Scripture that has metaphors of vineyards, in this story, it produces wild grapes or bad fruit and is thrown out and burned, and it is a judgment upon the nation of Israel, the people of Judah. And it's an explanation or a response of why the people were defeated in the war and carted off to Babylon. That's what the whole book of Isaiah is all about. And it suggests that what they were doing were being wild, not following the way of God. Now, Luke's gospel has Jesus saying that he's come to cast fire and division upon the earth. Nice guy, this Jesus. And he will divide peoples and families, and there will be judgment until a debt to God is paid. Again, like Isaiah, he uses something of a metaphor here. Now, one wonders what the scripture writers had in mind with all of this stuff. Of course, part of what Luke had in mind, like I was talking about last week, was his opinion that the world was soon coming to an end. That Christ's second coming was imminent, and that in the second coming, Christ would judge the living and the dead. So I suspect that part of what was going on here was Luke trying to push, force, threaten people with judgment so that they would come to Christ sooner and not be lost. Now, Luke's technique has been repeated many, many times over the centuries. An angry God, a judgmental Christ, has been used many times to inject fear into people for the sake of scaring them into salvation. Mostly, such judgment was used for political purposes, if anything we say is a reading of history. A German king and Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, was excommunicated. His soul was removed from salvation by Pope Gregory IV for fighting Gregory's reforms. Henry stood outside the Pope's castle in the snow for 3 days in January of 1077, asking for the Pope's restoration of his soul and the Pope's blessing, which he got. And then he went back to causing trouble for the Pope's reforms. Go figure. Henry VIII of England was excommunicated for taking his country out of the Roman Catholic Church. Lots of common souls were excommunicated by their rulers for grumbling or revolting or other things. It seems that kings and counts and other rulers were given that sort of power over their serfs. The veneration or elevating of Mary in Catholic theology dates from this time, because it was thought that if there was a harsh judgment of God and a vengeful Christ, well, maybe if we appealed to Jesus' mother for compassion and mercy, what sort of son doesn't listen to his mother? That's the way the veneration of Mary in Roman Catholic theology came about. The judgment of God in the history of the church has primarily been used as a political tool to keep people in line. And I think that it's also been used as a political tool and being used as a political tool in a lot of churches today to keep people in line. It's a power play more than it is a theological, biblical proclamation. Still, we have to consider what these scriptures are saying to us. Is God here to guide us and call us into account? Well, yes, kind of, sort of. God desperately and powerfully loves us and would like us to live on holy paths and lives. But what we do is we turn that that love into rules and restrictions and power games because of our sin of that love, of the love, in order rather than the love itself. Last fall, I did my workshop on cultural change at the Regional Assembly, and one of the questions that came up was about traditions and cultural practices in the life of the church and why it was so hard to change. And my response, as near as I can remember it, was the fact that all too often our love of order is a security blanket for us, rather than an expression of our love for God. And that creation is a messy place and process, and that sometimes our love of order is sin, because it gets in the way of embracing God's messy creation. A little more spontaneity, a lot more imagination is what's called for. And I think that part of what Jesus is proclaiming about division in this passage is that the call of God is one that challenges us to separate ourselves from what is secure and normal. We like harmony and order. We like things to be predictable with just enough variety to keep things interesting. But the call of God is one that shakes us up and causes us to struggle and leads us sometime into conflicts with those who we hold dear. That father and son, mother and daughter thing in the passage. Now, this is not the normal conflict that's part of daily life. This is a holy conflict, struggling to redefine God's presence and will and power in our lives. As my theology professor, Clark Williamson, who most of you have heard about many times from me, put it, sometimes God's work is to bring order out of chaos, but sometimes God works at creating chaos in order to bring about a higher form of order later on. I've never encountered anybody's Christian journey that didn't have an element of chaos and struggle in it. How else are we to grow as souls, my brothers and sisters? To grow in God's way and will and love, it takes a struggle. It takes work. And sometimes it takes arguing with your family. Now, granted, we have a ton of conflict in this world, and families who fight with families, within their families, and nations fighting nations, and tribes against tribes. It goes on all over the place. But most of these are power plays and politics for the sake of those in power, that they might stay there. Every bit of change in our culture has happened because of those who've taken on the system and taken it on as a holy cause and stirred the pot and gone into conflict for the sake of creating that higher order. The abolition movement, women's suffrage, civil rights movement, gay rights movement, and so on, all have been causes that have improved our culture. They've been holy causes. But they sure caused a ton of squabbles along the way, didn't they? And haven't they? And don't they still? Families divided around the issues. Father against son, mother against daughter. Cultural progress, as well as individual progress, can't take place without struggle. But ultimately, in the midst of the struggle, what needs to happen as well is reconciliation. Coming together and making peace and compromise. That also has to come through. I think that's what the last of the part of the passage has to say to us. It reminds us that if we have a dispute with one another, we're supposed to work at making peace with one another. Otherwise, if it goes before the court, the judge might find you against you and toss you in the slammer. The ultimate goal of the struggle is not alienation. It's the bringing together of people into unity. Not uniformity, but unity. Where we can express both our differences in diversity and our oneness in unity in the same breath. We can allow one another to be different and yet find ourselves to be one. In the midst of our highly divided culture at this time, that is something we desperately need to recognize and work on and pray for. So is there judgment from a God of grace? Yes, there is. But it is a judgment designed to move us forward and onward into growing as souls. That ultimately what reigns is peace and oneness with the Holy One. God's judgment is a judgment of grace.